There is a persistent illusion, especially among first-time founders, that building a startup is a sequence of correct decisions, that if you are smart enough or disciplined enough or simply informed enough, you can choose the right path at every fork and avoid the chaos that seems to define so many failed companies. But the longer you stay in the game, the more obvious it becomes that startup life is not about choosing correctly. It is about surviving and navigating a series of opposing forces that are both right at the same time, and learning how to hold them in tension without breaking, while quietly, almost in the background, trying to move everything, however incrementally, toward a higher standard of excellence. A startup is not a linear journey. It is a constant negotiation between now and later, between fear and hope, between what works and what lasts. And if you zoom out far enough, everything reduces to dualities, but what those dualities often obscure is that the goal is not to resolve them perfectly, it is to operate within them while still pushing consistently toward building something that is genuinely excellent. Every startup begins with a simple, uncomfortable truth. If you do not survive the short term, there is no long term to optimize for, and this manifests in decisions that feel wrong even when they are necessary. Like shipping a product you know is not ready, like prioritizing revenue over polish, like making bets that you would never justify in a more stable environment. Because survival compresses your time horizon and forces you to trade elegance for immediacy, even when you are aware that excellence is being deferred rather than achieved. At Postly, this showed up in the decision to run a lifetime deal, a move that brought in a much-needed cash haul at a time when the product was still buggy and far from the standard we wanted to represent. And while it would be easy to frame that decision as a mistake in hindsight, the more honest framing is that it bought time, and time is the most valuable currency a startup can have in its earliest stage. Because without it, you do not get the opportunity to refine anything toward excellence at all. But time bought under pressure comes with consequences deferred, not avoided, and the same product that generated cash eventually buckled under its own weight, culminating in a dashboard crash that made it clear that no amount of patchwork could sustain the system we had built. And in that moment, the long term came crashing back into focus, forcing a reset that was both painful and necessary, because the only real path forward was to rebuild toward a standard that could actually hold. There is a version of pessimism that keeps you alive, and a version of optimism that keeps you moving, and startups require both in uncomfortable proportions, because the pessimism is what makes you question your assumptions, double-check your systems, and anticipate failure points before they compound, while the optimism is what allows you to continue building in the face of repeated evidence that things are harder than expected, slower than planned, and more fragile than you would like. And without pessimism, you drift into carelessness, while without optimism, you lose the will to push anything toward a better state. Most days, you are both at once, trying to see clearly what is broken while still believing it can be made excellent. In the early days, speed feels like the only thing that matters because speed generates feedback, and feedback creates the illusion of progress, and progress is often the only thing keeping morale intact, but speed accumulates debt, not just technical debt, but product debt and trust debt, and at some point the system demands repayment, often all at once. For us, that moment came when incremental fixes were no longer enough, and the only viable path forward was to rebuild the dashboard from scratch, slowly, deliberately, and with a level of care that felt almost unnatural compared to the pace we had operated at before, because we were no longer optimizing for movement, we were optimizing for correctness. It meant making harder decisions too, including reducing the engineering team down to the two most experienced members, not as an act of austerity, but as a recognition that complexity requires clarity, and clarity often comes from fewer, more aligned minds working deeply rather than many working quickly, because at a certain point, effort is no longer the limiting factor, alignment is, and alignment is what allows you to actually produce something excellent rather than just something fast. There is a common debate about whether product or distribution matters more, but in practice they are inseparable, and the imbalance between them is what creates most problems. Because a strong distribution engine can amplify a weak product temporarily, but it also accelerates its failure by exposing its flaws to more users, while a strong product without distribution remains invisible, a solution waiting for a problem it never gets to solve. The lifetime deal brought distribution, but the crash exposed the product, and the rebuild forced alignment, reinforcing the uncomfortable truth that marketing does not fix product quality, it reveals it. And if what it reveals is not excellent, the feedback loop becomes destructive rather than constructive. Growth is loud, visible, and easy to celebrate, while retention is quiet, stubborn, and often ignored until it becomes a problem, But retention is where truth lives, because revenue can be misleading in the short term, while user behavior is much harder to distort. The lifetime deal brought in cash, but it also created a distorted signal because money tells you people want something, while retention tells you whether it is actually worth continuing to use, and that distinction becomes critical once the initial momentum fades. After stabilizing the product, the focus naturally shifted toward improving reliability and reducing churn. Because a stable product does not just retain users, it builds trust, and trust compounds over time in ways that acquisition alone cannot replicate, especially when it is grounded in a product that consistently does what it is meant to do. Speed versus reliability. There is another layer beneath product quality that only becomes visible after things break, which is that you do not earn trust by shipping more. You earn it by breaking less, because users do not remember how fast you shipped a feature. They remember whether the product worked when they needed it. The dashboard crash was not just a technical failure, it was a trust reset. And rebuilding was not just about functionality, it was about restoring a level of reliability that users could depend on without thinking about it, which is ultimately what excellence looks like from the outside. Building is exciting, it is visible, it feels like progress, while maintaining is quiet, repetitive, and often undervalued, consisting of fixing edge cases, improving reliability, and reducing friction. But this is where real companies are formed, because this is where products move from being interesting to being dependable. There is a dangerous phase where everything looks like it is working, where features are shipping, users are signing up, and momentum feels real. But sometimes that momentum is superficial because real momentum is slower, and it comes from stability, satisfaction, and compounding improvements that are not immediately visible but become undeniable over time. Early on, everything feels possible, and that sense of possibility can be energizing. But it can also be distracting because it encourages you to build broadly rather than deeply. At some point, the question shifts from what can we build to what do we want to be known for, and that shift forces trade-offs that are less about capability and more about identity, because excellence requires focus, and focus requires letting go of paths that might have worked but would have diluted what you are trying to become. Nothing in a startup is truly temporary because every shortcut eventually becomes part of the system, and every workaround becomes something you have to maintain whether you intended it or not. That quick fix, that "we'll clean it up later," that compromise made under pressure, it all accumulates, and the rebuild was not just starting over, it was paying back accumulated decisions, replacing fragile structures with ones that could actually support the level of quality we wanted to reach. The introduction of AI lowered the barrier to entry across many categories, including ours, and almost overnight, the landscape became crowded with new entrants, each promising faster, smarter, or more automated solutions. This initially feels threatening because it creates noise and compresses differentiation. But over time, a pattern emerged where many of these products appeared quickly, gained attention quickly, and disappeared just as quickly. Because while the barrier to starting had dropped, the difficulty of building something reliable, scalable, and genuinely valuable had not. Endurance became the differentiator, and endurance is not just about staying in the game, it is about consistently choosing to build toward a higher standard, even when faster, easier options are available. What ties all of these dualities together is not luck, and not even raw effort, but discipline in product management and clarity in marketing. Because product management is what forces you to make explicit trade-offs instead of accidental ones, deciding when to prioritize speed and when to invest in quality, when to listen to users and when to lead them, when to expand and when to focus. Marketing ensures that whatever you build is understood, positioned, and delivered to the right audience in a way that reflects its actual value, not just its immediate capabilities, because without this alignment, even a good product can be misunderstood, and without a good product, even the best marketing only accelerates failure. Conclusion: startups do not fail because founders choose the wrong side of a duality. They fail because they do not recognize that both sides are necessary, and that the real skill lies in knowing when to lean into one and when to rebalance toward the other, all while maintaining a clear sense of what standard they are ultimately trying to reach. If there is one practical takeaway, it is this: plan your early-stage survival well enough to give your startup the time it needs to mature, because most of the advantages that matter, product quality, brand trust, operational stability, only reveal themselves over time, and time is the one thing you do not get unless you deliberately create it. Everything else is just the tension you learn to live with, and the quiet, continuous effort to make something that is not just functional but excellent.